reforms we need to, but and let's do the job we're supposed to. I yield the floor.
The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor this afternoon to talk about the fact that 50 years ago today, President Lyndon Johnson made his first State of the Union address, and he used that date, January 8, 1964, to chart a new agenda for the country and to declare that America would take on an unconditional war on poverty. And with that directive, Congress worked on some of the most successful programs in the history of our country: Medicare, Head Start, Pell Grants, expansions to Social Security. President Johnson knew that the devastation of poverty went deeper than just the lack of a job or the lack of basic needs. Americans in poverty didn't even have a fair chance to make a better life for themselves and their families. Now, since 1964, economists estimate the poverty rate has now fallen by 10% when accounting for social safety net programs. So we are moving in the right direction, but we have a lot more work to do to give everyone the fair chance they need to succeed in this country. Madam President, for too many people today, the war on poverty is a daily battle just to make ends meet. More than 46 million people in our country live in poverty. 46 million people. That's according to the Census Bureau. More than 20%, that is 1 in 5 of our kids in this country, live in poverty. So to win this fight, we need to strengthen the programs that support those in need. Without question, one of the reasons that we have seen a decline in poverty is because of the programs that provide a safety net for our most vulnerable Americans. In 1964, Congress created the food stamp program for those struggling just to feed their families. Today it's known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or better known as SNAP. In 2012 alone, the SNAP program lifted 4.9 million people out of poverty, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Now, we've also worked to make sure preschoolers from low-income areas have the building blocks they need to start kindergarten ready to learn. Since the mid-1960s, Head Start has provided early childhood learning and health services to more than 30 million children and their families. That's the kind of progress that we have got to continue. Those programs, and many like them, have provided economic security and opportunity to millions across the country. And yet, even with the successes we've had in fighting hunger and in unemployment, there are those today here in Congress who want to slash the very assistance that gives so many Americans today an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families. Madam President, we can't waver in the fight to give all Americans a fair chance to get ahead. We've got to expand opportunities for young learners by investing in universal pre-K. We have to ensure that workers can earn enough to put food on the table by raising the minimum wage. And we have to keep fighting, and we've got to win the war on poverty. I know personally how vital these programs are. When I was just 15 years old, my dad, he'd fought in World War, he was a veteran, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And within just a few years, he couldn't work anymore. My mom found a job. She stayed home to raise 7 kids, and the job she found wasn't enough to support 7 kids and my dad, who had a growing stack of medical bills. And all of a sudden, my family, without any warning, had fallen on hard times. This country at that time didn't turn its back on us. For several months, my family relied on food stamps. It wasn't much, but it helped us get by. With the help of a government program, my mom was fortunate to attend Lake Washington Vocational Technical School and got the training she needed to get a better job so she could support our family. My older brother, my twin sister, and I were able to stay in college because of student loans and support from what we now call Pell Grants, all from this government. Even through those hard times, none of us lost hope. We had a lot of hard work, we had help from our government, and we were able to get to where we are today. Madam President, that's why I believe so strongly that here in Congress today we've got to expand that hope that I had as a young girl to many, many more families and Americans who are struggling today. 50 years ago, President Johnson recognized poverty is a national program. It's a national problem. And that's why he made it a national priority. So I think we ought to rededicate ourselves today to that national priority. Let's work together here to support the men and women across the country who hope for their chance at an American dream. Let's not just commemorate this anniversary. Let's begin to use and have a renewed energy to winning the war on poverty in our country once and for all. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about an amendment that I will seek to offer on the pending bill, Amendment number 2603. We all sympathize with those who are struggling to find work in a difficult economy, and I want to see people get back to work. Certainly, a short-term extension for those who are relying on unemployment insurance, if it's paid for, will allow a transition for those who are out of work to do what we need to do most in this chamber and to give them an opportunity to get a good-paying job. The focus in this chamber most of all needs to be on enacting pro-growth policies that will encourage both small and large businesses to thrive and grow in our economy and to create jobs. I have voted today to begin debate on the legislation to provide a temporary extension of unemployment insurance. And I voted to begin this debate because I believe that both sides of the aisle can find a way to grant this temporary extension to those who are struggling to find work in this difficult economy, while making sure that we don't add to the $17 trillion of debt that also threatens our country and our economy. And I continue to believe that any temporary extension in the long-term unemployment benefits should be paid for in a responsible.
Madam President, 50 years ago today, President Johnson declared a war on poverty. He said, I quote, "Very often, a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. The cause may lie deeper in our failure to give citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities, in a lack of education and training, in a lack of medical care and housing," end quote. He proposed a broad range of new initiatives to address these deeper failures: Medicare, Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, housing and transportation programs. These initiatives have given millions of people more opportunities to succeed and help them get back on their feet when they stumble. President Johnson called on Congress to take up these proposals because, he said, "Many Americans live on the outskirts of hope. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity," end quote. That is still our task today. We've come a long way since 1964, but clearly the fight is not over. For years, the American dream has been that if you work hard and play by the rules, you will succeed. However, the divide between the very rich and the very poor is as wide as it has ever been. Wages have stagnated, and more middle-class families struggle to get ahead and provide opportunities for their children. We have to carry on the work that began 50 years ago and update it for the needs of our modern economy. Let's keep fighting to create new, good-paying jobs in sustainable American industries. Let's make sure that all Americans have access to education and training needed to get those jobs and succeed. Let's work to make sure that as our economy grows, so do middle-class incomes and the opportunity to climb into the middle class and beyond. I want to talk briefly about 3 ideas toward these goals. First, let's increase the minimum wage so workers earn more than poverty-level wages. Second, let's make education more accessible from pre-K through college so that Americans are well prepared for the jobs of the future. Finally, let's strengthen the safety net programs that have kept so many out of poverty so working families can get through the tough times and get back on their feet. First, our economy has grown 4-fold over the last 50 years, but the poor and middle class have not seen enough of the benefits of this growth. According to census data, the economy is producing 45% more per person than it was in 1987, but real median income has remained flat. Workers earning minimum wage have fared even worse because today's federal minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. The 1968 minimum wage adjusted for inflation would be $10.68 today, not $7.25. That means the minimum wage has lost 1/3 of its buying power. It's no wonder our families are struggling. The minimum wage should be increased. Raising the minimum wage is important for many Americans, but it is particularly important for women. Most minimum wage workers, over 64% of them, are women. Today, millions of women are trapped in minimum wage jobs. The federal minimum wage of $7.25 yields only $15,000 per year for a full-time worker. If this woman is supporting a child or an elderly parent, as is often the case, their family income would be below the federal poverty line. Their situation is even more dire in Hawaii, where the cost of living is much higher. Fighting poverty is a women's issue. Poverty hurts more women and children than men. More than 58% of adults in poverty are women. More than 1 in 7 women, nearly 17.8 million, live in poverty. And more than 1 in 5 children, about 21.8%, are poor, almost twice the rate for adult men. The low minimum wage hurts not only workers, and particularly women workers and children. It's unfair to taxpayers. That's because minimum wage workers are often eligible for food assistance, housing vouchers, and other safety net programs. This means we taxpayers are subsidizing companies that pay their workers poverty wages. If we want to reduce government spending and make more workers fully self-sufficient, raising the minimum wage is a good place to start. Second, expanding access to education from birth to college and career training will build new ladders out of poverty. When I came to this country as an 8-year-old immigrant, my mother enrolled me in Hawaii public schools, and that's where I learned English and developed a love of reading. When I graduated from Kaimuki High School, I attended the University of Hawaii. The Higher Education Act of 1965 helped me and millions of other students pay for college through work-study and low-interest federal student loans. Today, we need to strengthen our commitment to our next generation of scientists, architects, teachers, and innovators. I know firsthand the power of a quality education, and that's why for years I've been fighting for quality preschool in Hawaii and nationwide. Children in poverty come to kindergarten with half the vocabulary of their higher income peers. If they start school already behind, how can we expect them to catch up? President Johnson helped pass the Head Start Act. This law helped millions of poor children attend preschool while parents got the skills they needed to help their kids at home. Since then, we've reformed and strengthened Head Start quality, but still, fewer than half of eligible 3- and 4-year-olds can get a Head Start seat. Fewer than 1 in 20 eligible infants and toddlers can get a spot in early Head Start. The federal government can't do it all. State and local governments want to do their parts too. And that is why governors, educators, and legislators across the country, both Republicans and Democrats, have expanded state preschools in 2013. Let's support their efforts. This Congress, I worked with Senators Harkin, Murray, Casey, and others to introduce the Strong Start for America's Children's Act. This bill will create a federal-state partnership for high-quality preschool. It includes elements from my Pre-K Act, so states like Hawaii that have farther to go can have more support as they build up their preschool system. The bill's supporters include parents, educators, business leaders, and even police. They recognize that we can pay for quality preschool now or pay later for law enforcement when kids drop out of school and commit crimes. Let's come together to get this done. While we need to focus on helping kids start kindergarten ready to succeed, we also need to improve access to higher education when they graduate from high school. With student debt skyrocketing, the Pell Grant is a bedrock investment in college access. In 1978, the Pell Grant helped pay for 75% of college costs at a 4-year public university. Today, it pays for only a third. This year, I plan to introduce the Pell Grant Protection Act, a bill to strengthen and preserve the Pell Grant. There's also more we can do, like simplifying the federal student aid process, improving work-study, and expanding access to adult basic education. I look forward to working on these and other efforts in the Higher Education Act and Workforce Investment Act this year. Third, let's strengthen our safety net programs, including Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. These programs provide real hope and real opportunity for people. I know this because I've lived it. My mother raised 3 children by herself. Most of us have relied upon or known families who have relied upon food stamps or unemployment insurance. My mother's unemployment checks were a safety net for us, providing us with much-needed temporary help. They gave us breathing room and put food on the table while she searched for work. I know the anxiety when the family breadwinner loses her job through no fault of her own. These safety net programs have helped keep millions of Americans out of poverty. Using the Census Supplemental Poverty Measure, the national poverty rate has gone down from 26% in 1967 to 16% in 2012. Without safety net programs, the poverty rate would have climbed to 29%. Seniors would have been hurt especially badly. Thus, it's alarming to see many of my Republican colleagues calling to shred the safety net programs. They propose drastic cuts to SNAP, to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and a host of other vital supports. The basic idea of the safety net is to prevent people from falling so far behind that they can't catch up. So instead of making cuts, we should strengthen these programs and, of course, focus on creating jobs. With the challenges facing our families today, the war on poverty continues. Let's not give in to the naysayers seeking to dismantle our safety net. Let's not retreat in our efforts to help people climb out of poverty. Let's fight even harder to provide an opportunity agenda, one that reaffirms the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can get ahead. If we work together, I know we can get this done. Madam President, I yield the floor. I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about an amendment that I will seek to offer on the pending bill, Amendment number 2603. We all sympathize with those who are struggling to find work in a difficult economy, and I want to see people get back to work. Certainly, a short-term extension for those who are relying on unemployment insurance, if it's paid for, will allow a transition for those who are out of work to do what we need to do most in this chamber and to give them an opportunity to get a good-paying job. The focus in this chamber most of all needs to be on enacting pro-growth policies that will encourage both small and large businesses to thrive and grow in our economy and to create jobs. I have voted today to begin debate on the legislation to provide a temporary extension of unemployment insurance. And I voted to begin this debate because I believe that both sides of the aisle can find a way to grant this temporary extension to those who are struggling to find work in this difficult economy, while making sure that we don't add to the $17 trillion of debt that also threatens our country and our economy. And I continue to believe that any temporary extension in the long-term unemployment benefits should be paid for in a responsible manner. So I have introduced an amendment, AOT Amendment 2603. I think it's an amendment that makes a ton of sense. And let me tell you what this amendment does. This amendment pays for the 3-month extension of unemployment insurance. It fixes the unfair cut to military cost of living that was just enacted in the budget that I voted against because I felt that this was unfair to those who have served in our military and were singled out for cuts to their retirement benefits, unlike anyone else, including, by the way, those who were retired because they had a medical retirement. In other words, those that many of us, I know that the President has visited Walter Reed, as have I, those who have lost arms, legs, they receive a medical retirement, and their cost of living was cut under this budget as well. So my amendment not only would pay for this temporary unemployment insurance for those who are struggling to find work, to give them a transition, to get them back to work, but it would also...
So I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I would also ask unanimous consent, Madam President, that Senator McConnell or his designee be recognized from 2 o'clock to 2:45 this afternoon.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to address the question that's currently before the body here, and that's whether we should extend the emergency unemployment insurance for millions of Americans who are still unable to find work. This is in addition to the 26 weeks that's provided in most states, some a little more, some a little less. And the question is whether we extend this again, as we have done several times since the Great Recession. The question is, should we extend it, and if so, how should we extend it? Should we pay for it? Should there be some training or other requirements attached to it so that it works better? It's a good debate to have. I came on the floor yesterday to say, let's have a full debate on this issue. It's one of great importance to folks who are unemployed. It's also important to our nation as a whole that we deal with this issue to encourage economic growth, to get people back to work. I encouraged yesterday the Senate majority to permit appropriate amendments to this legislation. That's one reason I voted to proceed, of course, with the understanding that we would have the opportunity to talk about this issue and debate it and offer amendments. One, I think, ought to be how we pay for it. And second, we ought to be able to deal with the underlying problem. You know, unemployment insurance is more of a Band-Aid, and we need to be sure that we're dealing with the underlying problem of a weak economy and the lack of jobs and the lack of connection between the skills that are needed and the jobs that are available. Let's really get at this problem in a serious way. I'll be frank, I heard from a lot of people in the last 24 hours after the vote on the motion to proceed that they were surprised that I voted to proceed and that other Republicans did as well, because they thought Republicans would all vote against it. And in fact, I saw some press reports this morning indicating that some of the Democratic leadership would have been happier had that motion failed last night, because then they could say, well, we're blaming Republicans for being obstructionists. I don't think my colleagues who voted the other way were being obstructionists. I think their concern was that they weren't going to have the opportunity to debate this issue and to offer amendments that are sensible, that are relevant to the issue at hand, like how we pay for it and how we improve unemployment insurance so it works better for those who are unemployed. But anyway, for my part, I took my colleagues at their word when they said they're serious about actually improving unemployment insurance and taking serious steps to deal with the lack of growth and economic opportunity in our economy today. So in good faith, I voted on this motion to proceed yesterday, hoping again that we would be willing here in this body to have real debate, which is what the Senate is supposed to be about, have a debate over the long-term, fiscally sound way forward on unemployment. So I've come to the floor today and in an effort to be sure that people understand there are alternatives out there, offer a specific idea to pay for the unemployment insurance, one that deals with fraud and abuse, one that's out of the President's budget, actually, one that should be bipartisan. I've heard earlier today some have come to the floor on the other side of the aisle and said, we shouldn't pay for this extension. You know, we should just go further into debt and deficit. My question would be, if we can pay for it, why wouldn't we? You know, why would we want to take the country further into deficit this year, bust the budget caps that we just established in the budget agreement? And I was one of 9 Republicans who voted for that budget agreement. It wasn't perfect, but it set up a process going forward where we can get back to our constitutional duties here in the United States Senate of actually appropriating, meaning the oversight necessary on the federal departments and agencies has been nowhere for the last 4 years when we haven't had a budget, and then prioritizing spending. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That's our constitutional responsibility. It also didn't raise taxes. It also does have a little bit of deficit reduction, not as much as it should have. It wasn't perfect, but it enabled us to move forward. So I voted for that budget, and now we're talking about, right after that, putting forward an unemployment emergency extension that is not paid for, that will bust those very caps. I'm told a budget point of order is going to lie against this because of it. Well, that's not the way we should go. Let's pay for it. The debt and deficit is affecting our economy today. And it's like a wet blanket over the economy. You can't have trillion-dollar deficits year in and year out. This year it's $680 billion. People are saying, oh, that's great. Are you kidding? It's the 5th highest deficit in the history of our country. And it all adds up to a $17 trillion debt, unprecedented. Now, I believe that's understated, given all the liabilities we have as a government. But the point is, we have never had debts of this level. They're historic levels. And it is not only the wrong thing to do for our economy today and to help getting people back to work, but it's also clearly unfair to do to future generations. Got some young people on the floor tonight or this afternoon, and it's, I think, even immoral that we're leaving this to them. So let's pay for this. I was glad to hear Senator Reid say yesterday of our efforts to fund this legislation, quote, "If they come with something serious, I'll talk to them," end quote. Well, I've got something serious, and I think other members will as well. Something that reflects, in my case, reforms proposed in the President's own budget, ideas that should be bipartisan. My amendment would close a loophole that opens the system to double dipping. And what do I mean by that? It's called concurrent receipts, where somebody's getting one federal program and then another federal program they shouldn't be eligible for if they've got the first one. Specifically, people who are both on Social Security disability insurance, meaning they can't work, SSDI, and also receiving funds from unemployment insurance, which means you're looking for a job or you're working. We also add trade adjustment assistance. It's exactly the same theory. We shouldn't allow double dipping. In fact, we should stop this abuse. This is in the President's budget. This reform makes sense. Social Security disability was designed to help people who are unable to work because of a serious medical condition. And as we all know, the law requires those on unemployment insurance to actively seek out job opportunities. So, you know, the two don't work together. Let's stop the double dipping. These two programs are mutually exclusive. Now, those who can't work should be on disability. Those who can work should be on unemployment insurance if they're eligible. By passing this simple amendment, we can close this loophole and save $5.4 billion, almost enough to pay for the entire 3-month extension that we're talking about on the table here today. It's about $6.3 billion. In addition, I'll be adding another provision to my amendment that takes the unemployment insurance program integrity provisions directly out of the President's budget. So these are programs, again, in the President's budget to ensure that the unemployment insurance program is working properly, again, taking out the fraud and the abuse in it. The President's budget instructs the Department of Labor to implement it. My amendment does too. By implementing the President's own plan to reduce these improper payments and speed reemployment, we save even more money in the long run. And this pays for, again, this unemployment extension over 3 months. So I hope we can pass my amendment, pay for this extension, and show that this legislation is not just about politics. What we're talking about here on the floor today is not just about politics. It's about actually helping people who are unemployed to get back to work. I hope when my Democratic colleagues say they're ready to take real action on getting our economy moving again and help Americans who are suffering, that they mean it. By the way, the fact we're having this debate, the fact that so many Americans are in need of long-term unemployment insurance, this in and of itself shows that something's not working. In fact, as we've talked about on this floor before, we are now at historic levels in terms of long-term unemployment, people who have been unemployed for more than 26 weeks. The approach taken by the administration and many of my colleagues here and in the other body to bring down unemployment and get the economy moving really can't be seen to have worked by their own standards. You recall that we had a stimulus package and it was said that unemployment would be far lower than it is today. So by their own standards, it just hasn't worked. If it had, we wouldn't be debating this today. We wouldn't be talking about the need for an extension on an emergency basis of unemployment insurance. We can't spend our way to prosperity, and that's what we tried to do, in my view, in the stimulus package, and that's one reason it hasn't worked. We certainly tried that over the last 5 years. If you look at what the government has done, we've spent trillions of dollars we didn't have. We've burdened the next generation with previously unimaginable debt levels, as we talked about earlier. We've now run 5 years of historic deficits, 5 years. Trillion-dollar deficits the first 4 years. Before this administration, we'd never had a trillion-dollar deficit. Last year's deficit, again, $680 billion, fifth largest in history, is certainly no cause for celebration, particularly when the Congressional Budget Office tells us that we're going to go back to trillion-dollar deficits within 10 years. So we obviously have a huge problem in terms of our debt and deficit. What do we have to show for all the spending that we did? 71 months after the recession began, the economy is still not recovered the jobs we lost in that recession. This has never happened in the history of our country. We've never had a recovery this weak. We're down 1.3 million jobs. By comparison, we were up 10.4 million jobs at this point after the 1981-82 recession. That recession was also deep. In fact, it was deeper if you measure it by number of people who were unemployed. Ronald Reagan came in and, frankly, he took pro-growth policies and put them in place, and it helped to create millions of jobs. By this time, we were up 10.4 million jobs after that recession. We were up 9.8 million jobs after the 1990 recession at this point. We were up 4.8 million jobs after the 2001 recession. Remember, that recovery was called the jobless recovery. Again, we haven't even gained back to jobs at all yet after this recession. We were up 4.8 million jobs at this point after the 2001 recession. Making matters even worse, 1 out of every 3 unemployed persons have been out of work for 27 weeks or longer. As I said, this rate of long-term unemployment is at levels we haven't seen. You'd think we would have learned a lesson here in Washington. You would think that Washington would want to do something differently. And yet I heard the President and the Majority Leader just yesterday present an unemployment extension as if it were some kind of economic panacea, the silver bullet, justifying their failure to pay for this extension with all the growth they say it will generate. Well, the Senate Majority Leader said yesterday, and I quote, "For every dollar we spend on unemployment benefits, it gets $1.50 back to us just like that." Just like that? Think about this. If unemployment benefits create so much growth, why would we just do a 3-month extension? Why not a 3-year extension? Why would there be any limit? Money may not grow on trees, but apparently in the eyes of some, it grows from government programs. That's just not how the economy works. I know there are economists out there you can cite for just about anything, but the President's own economic advisors have written that unemployment benefits slow down the search for jobs. But we don't need to get into a battle of experts here. History has proven that just spending more money, even on unemployment benefits, is not the solution. It's not the long-term serious solution to the problems we face as a country. This extension, if it passes, will be the 11th time we've extended unemployment benefits in the last 5 years. These extensions have cost more than $200 billion. No economic boom has resulted from this spending, just as it didn't result, as I said earlier, from the $1 trillion in stimulus money. If spending were the answer, we wouldn't be standing here today having this debate. We'd be celebrating full employment. Mr. President, our economy would not be better off if we had higher unemployment and we were paying out more in unemployment benefits. And that's kind of the logical extension of what has been argued on the other side as to why we can't pay for this. I can't imagine anyone actually believes this. Yet for too long we've treated government spending as if it does create wealth. But if I take $1 from you, take $1 from one person, and give that dollar to somebody else, that other person may be better off, but I didn't add a dollar to the economy. Government programs have to come from somewhere. So that dollar is being taken from somewhere, given to somebody else, and somehow the notion is that's going to add to the economy. Again, the logical extension is let's just continue to provide more and more government spending. Everything will be great. That's not how it works. Dividing the pie up differently doesn't create more pie. It creates real, concrete, pro-growth policies to do that. Policies that mean we're paying out less in unemployment benefits because more people have the skills they need to get good jobs. That's what we ought to be talking about. Yes, I'm willing to extend unemployment insurance and pay for it. But during that period, let's come up with a better unemployment insurance program that actually connects people to the jobs that are out there. Because there are a lot of jobs that require skills that are not being filled. And the unemployment system ought to both, for long-term and even for the short-term, focus on that. How do you create better skills so that people have the opportunity, have the tools to be able to access those jobs? Policies that allow more companies and small businesses to produce quality products they can sell here and around the world, creating better jobs in the process would help. Implementing these kind of policies are not as easy as extending unemployment benefits for a few months or raising the minimum wage. We won't be able to ram these kind of policies through in a week on a party-line vote with no debate and no amendments, but they're the real solution to the chronic unemployment we're seeing in our states. And they're the only way to encourage the kind of income mobility that will close the income gap, not by tearing people down, but by bringing people up. Pro-growth economic policies obviously need to be part of the solution here. If we extend unemployment insurance, we should do so because people are hurting as a result of the failed policies of Washington. But we shouldn't kid ourselves into believing that this extension alone will somehow solve these economic problems. And again, it certainly won't pay for itself. As I said earlier, you can't take a dollar away from one person, give it to someone else, and create more purchasing power. You're redistributing that across the economy. It doesn't have to be that way. We can pass these pay-for amendments. I've got my own amendments, as I said. Others have also proposed their amendments. I know Senator Ayotte has an amendment that I'm supporting that, again, gets at fraud and abuse in government programs to say, let's pay for the unemployment benefits. She also, by the way, pays for veterans' benefits that were cut during the budget agreement that we just passed. I also support that. And she has a little left over for actual deficit reduction. Senator Coburn's going to have a proposal out here. I think Senator Hatch will have one. Senator McConnell will have one. My understanding is that Senator Coburn has one that also is out of the President's budget. So there are plenty of ideas out there as to how to pay for this extension short term while we look at better ways to have the unemployment insurance system work to connect people who are unemployed to the jobs that are out there by giving them the skills that they need. That's where the hard work begins. We've got to get this country moving again. We've got to do things to actually increase economic growth and give people the skills that they need to access the jobs that are out there. We need to pass bills like the Career Act. That's bipartisan legislation I've introduced with Senator Mike Bennett from Colorado. In Ohio, we've got about 400,000 people unemployed, and we're told there are about 100,000 jobs right now open in Ohio. Now, a lot of these jobs are high-tech jobs. Some are in advanced manufacturing. Some are in bioscience. Some are in information technology. And we need to be sure that the people who are unemployed get the skills they need to be able to take advantage of those jobs, those opportunities. We can also start by working on tax reform. Everybody in this chamber talks about it. Let's do it. Corporate tax reform alone would result in a lot more revenue coming into the federal government by repatriating profits, and it would help expand opportunities, not for the boardroom, but for people who work in those companies. People have looked at this at the Congressional Budget Office. The economic experts have said if we did corporate business tax reform, over 70% of the benefit goes right to the workers. Higher pay, higher benefits. It's time to do these sorts of things to ensure that we have a growing economy. We are growing that pie, not just carving it up. Let's streamline the way we do regulations in this country. Currently, the United States ranks 34th in the world for the time it takes to get a government green light to actually build something. Think about that. This is a key World Bank measure for ease of doing business. We want America to be at the top of that list, not halfway down that list. Unless we do that, we're not going to see the kind of investment we want in this country. How many jobs lost every year because people can't get a permit, that a good idea can't be built? These are jobs that are there if we change the policies here in Washington, D.C. Congress continues to pat itself on the back for scoring political points rather than taking on these challenges that face our country. I can tell you who's not patting us on the back. It's the American people. They aren't happy. They aren't pleased with our progress, and there's good reason. They're actually seeing their take-home pay go down as the deficit goes up and as the President talks about a better economy. 50 years ago, the United States declared a war on poverty, and yet poverty is still a major problem. The goal was noble, but the tools we used were not up to the challenge. Since the recession began, 9 million more Americans have fallen into poverty, and the median household income is down more than 8%. Poverty rates have actually increased during this administration with the policies we've got. It's time for a change. For decades, we've exported to the nations around the world these principles that have allowed us to enjoy so much prosperity and success. We've said, follow the American way. The free enterprise system works. We've preached to them this gospel, as well as our belief that by removing the shackles of government interference from the market, whether in the form of overregulation, overspending, or overtaxing, everyone can prosper. As U.S. Trade Representative, I had the opportunity to travel all around the world representing our great country. It was a great honor, telling people the benefits of liberalizing trade, knocking down barriers to increase economic growth and opportunity. And it works. Entrepreneurs and job creators have lifted more people out of poverty around the world over the past few decades than any government program ever could, because the free enterprise system does work. We need to get back to that. Let's do something we can be proud of here in this chamber today. Let's empower the American people instead of the American government. Let's not kick the can of spending down the road any longer. Let's take some votes. Not all of them are going to be easy votes, and they shouldn't be. After all, that's what we're elected to do, take tough votes. These votes we take today, though, can make a real difference in people's lives. Let's start today. Let's pay for this legislation. Let's use these pay-fors we just talked about that are bipartisan, that are sensible, that can be supported on both sides of the aisle and in both bodies. Let's ensure that we put in place the pro-growth policies so that we aren't just giving people a little more unemployment insurance for a few months, but giving them the opportunity to get a job and the dignity and self-respect that comes with that. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, pay for this legislation, put politics aside, and get to work for the American people. Yield back my time, Mr. President.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum
The
call?
Republican leader.
Are we in a quorum call?
The Senate is not in a quorum call.
Mr. President, over the past several years, those of us who are fortunate enough to serve here have engaged in many fierce debates. Some have been forced upon us by external events, including a searing financial crisis, while others were brought about by an unapologetically liberal president who promised dramatic change and who's worked very hard to follow through on that pledge. In some cases, even in the face of legal obstacles and widespread public opposition. So change has indeed come. Despite the daily drumbeat of headlines about gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, the truth is an activist president and a Democratic-controlled Senate have managed to check off an awful lot of items on their wish list one way or another. And yet, just as important as what they did, my colleagues, is how they did it. Because that's also been at the heart of so many of the fights we've had around here over the past few years. Now, these conflicts haven't stemmed from personal grievances or contempt, as some would have it. They are instead the inevitable consequence of an administration that was in such a hurry to impose its agenda that it neglected to persuade the public of its wisdom and then cast aside one of the greatest tools we have in this country for guaranteeing a durable and stable legislative consensus. And that tool is the United States Senate. Remember, I think we all know partisanship is not some recent innovation here, invention. American politics has always been more or less divided between two ideological camps. Today, that's reflected in the two major parties, but it's actually always been there. On one side are those who proudly place their trust in government and its agents to guide our institutions and direct our lives. On the other are those of us who put our trust in the wisdom and the creativity of private citizens working voluntarily with each other and through more local mediating institutions guided by their own sense of what is right, what is fair, and what is good. Now, recent polling suggests, by the way, that most Americans fall squarely into the latter camp. People are generally confident in their local governments, but lack confidence in Washington. And yet, despite the political and ideological divides which have always existed in our country, we've almost always managed to work out our differences, not by humiliating the other side into submission, but through simple give and take. It is the secret of our success. The same virtues that make any friendship or marriage or family or business work are the ones that have always made this country work. And the place where it happens, the place where all the national conflicts and controversies that arise in this big, diverse, wonderful country of ours have always been resolved right here in this chamber, right here. Now, I realize it may not be immediately obvious why that's the case. But the fact is, every serious student of this institution, from de Tocqueville to our late colleague Robert Byrd, has seen the Senate as uniquely important to America's stability and to its flourishing. In their view, it's made all the difference. And here's why. Because whether it was the fierce early battles over the shape and scope of the federal government, or those that surrounded industrialization, or those that preceded and followed the nation-rending Civil War, or those surrounding the great wars of the 20th century, or the expansion of the franchise, or decades-long Cold War, or the War on Terror, we have always found a way forward. Sometimes haltingly, but always steadily. And the Senate is the tool that has enabled us to find our footing almost every time. I mention this because as we begin a new year, I think it's appropriate to step back from all the policy debates that have occupied us over the past few years and focus on another debate we've been having around here. And the debate we've been having around here is over the state of this institution. What have we become? It's not a debate that ever caught fire with the public or with the press. But it's a debate that should be of grave importance to all of us. Because on some level, every single one of us has to be at least a little bit uneasy about what happened here last November. But even if you're completely at peace about what happened in November, even if you think it was perfectly fine to violate the all-important rule that says changing the rules requires the assent of two-thirds of senators duly elected and sworn, none of us should be happy with the trajectory the Senate was on even before that day, even before November, or the condition that we find the Senate in 225 years after it was created. I don't think anybody's comfortable with where we are. I know I'm not. And I'll bet even though there's nobody over here at the moment, I bet almost none of them are either. So I'd like to share a few thoughts on what I think we've lost over the last 7 years and what I think can be done about it together. Now, together obviously requires the involvement, you would think, of some people on the other side of the aisle. And even though they're not here to listen, they have been invited. So let me state at the outset, it's not my intention to point the finger of blame at anybody. Though some of that is inevitable, I don't presume to have all the answers either, and I'm certainly not here to claim that we are without fault. But I'm certain of one thing. I'm absolutely certain of one thing. The Senate can be better than it is. Many of us around here have seen a better Senate than we have now, no matter who was in the majority. This institution can be better than it is. And I just can't believe that on some level, everyone in this chamber, including the folks on the other side, doesn't agree. It just can't be the case that we're content with the theatrics and the messaging wars that go on here day after day. It just can't be the case that senators who grew up reading about the great statesmen who made their name and their mark here over the years are now suddenly content to just stand in front of a giant poster board making some poll-tested point of the month, day after day after day, and then run back to our respective corners and congratulate each other on how right we are, I just can't believe we're all happy with that on either side. Don't misunderstand me. There's a time for making a political point, even scoring a few points. I know that as well as anybody. But it can't be the only thing we do here. I mean, surely we do something other than scoring political points against each other. It cheapens the service we've sworn to provide to our constituents. It cheapens the Senate, which is a lot bigger than any of us. So hopefully we can all agree that we got a problem here. Now, I realize both sides have their own favored account of what caused it. We've got our talking points. They've got their talking points. We all repeat them with great repetition. And we all congratulate each other for being on the right side of the debate. Look, I get that. The guys over there think Republicans abuse the rules, and we think they do. But as I said, my goal here isn't to make converts on that front. My purpose is to suggest that the Senate can do better than it has been, and that we must be if we're to remain as a great nation. And I think the crucial first step of any vision that gets us there is to recognize that vigorous debate about our differences isn't some sickness to be lamented. Vigorous debate is not a problem. When did that become a problem? It's actually a sign of strength to have vigorous debates. You know, it's a common refrain among pundits that the fights we have around here are pointless. They're not at all pointless. Every single debate we have around here is about something important. What's unhealthy is when we neglect the means that we've always used to resolve our differences. That's the real threat to this country, not more debate. When did that become a problem? And the best mechanism we have for working through our differences and arriving at a durable consensus is the United States Senate. An executive order can't do it. The fiat of a 9-person court can't do it. A raucous and gregarious partisan majority in the House can't do it. The only institution that can make stable and enduring laws is the one we have in which all 50 states are represented equally and where every single senator has a say in the laws that we pass. This is what the Senate was designed for. It is what the Senate is supposed to be about and almost always has been. Just take a look at some of the most far-reaching legislation of the past century. Look at the vote tallies. Medicare and Medicaid were both approved with the support of about half the members of the minority. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed with the votes of 30 out of the 32 members of the Republican minority, all but 2 Republican senators. There weren't many of them. That was a year after the Goldwater debacle. Only 2 senators voted against the Social Security Act, and only 8 voted against the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, none of this happened, by the way, none of it happened by throwing these bills together in the back room and dropping them on the floor with a stopwatch running. It happened through a laborious process of legislating, persuasion, coalition building. It took time, and it took patience and hard work, and it guaranteed that every one of these laws had stability. stability. Now compare that, if you will, to the attitude behind Obamacare. When Democrats couldn't convince any of us that the bill was worth supporting as written, they decided to do it on their own and pass it on a party line vote, and now we're seeing the result. The chaos this law has visited on our country isn't just deeply tragic, it was, my friends, entirely predictable. Entirely predictable. And that will always be the case if you approach legislation without regard for the views of the other side. Without some meaningful buy-in, you guarantee a food fight. You guarantee instability and you guarantee strife. It may very well have been the case that on Obamacare, the will of the country was not to pass the bill at all. That's what I would have concluded if Republicans couldn't get a single Democratic vote for legislation of that magnitude. I'd have thought, well, maybe this isn't such a great idea. But Democrats plowed forward anyway. They didn't want to hear it. And the results are clear. It's a mess, an absolute mess. The Senate exists to prevent that kind of thing. Because without a moderating institution like the Senate, today's majority passes something and tomorrow's majority repeals it. Today's majority proposes something, tomorrow's majority opposes it. We see that in the House all the time. But when the Senate is allowed to work the way it was designed to, it arrives at a result that's acceptable to people all along the political spectrum. That, my friends, is the whole point. We've lost our sense for the value of that. And none of us should be at peace with that. Because if America is to face up to the challenges we face in the decades ahead, she'll need the Senate the founders, in their wisdom, intended. Not the hollow shell of the Senate we have today. Not the hollow shell of the Senate we have today. First, one of the traditional hallmarks of the Senate is a vigorous committee process. It is also one of the main things we've lost. There was a time not that long ago when chairmen and ranking members had major influence and used their positions to develop national policy on everything from foreign policy to nuclear arms. These men and women enriched the entire Senate through their focus and their expertise. Just as importantly, they provided an important counterweight to the executive branch. They provided one more check on the White House. If a president thought something was a good idea, he'd better make sure he ran it by the committee chairman who'd been studying it for the past 2 decades. And if the chairman disagreed, well, then they'd have a serious debate and probably reach a better product as a result. The Senate should be setting national priorities, not simply waiting on the White House to do it for us. And the place to start that process is in the committees. With few exceptions, that's gone. With very few exceptions, that's gone. It's a big loss to the institution. But most importantly, it's a big loss for the American people who expect us to lead. And here's something else we've gained from a robust committee process over the years. Committees have actually served as a school of bipartisanship. And if you think about it, it just makes sense. By the time a bill gets through committee, you would expect it to come out in a form that was generally broadly acceptable to both sides. Nobody got everything, but more often than not, everybody got something. And the product was stable because there was buy-in and a sense of ownership on both sides, and on the rare occasions when that's happened recently, we've seen that work. The committee process today in the United States Senate is a shadow of what it used to be, thereby marginalizing, reducing the influence of every single member of the Senate on both sides of the aisle. Major legislation is now routinely drafted not in committee but in the majority leader's conference room and then dropped on the floor with little or no opportunity for members to participate in the amendment process, virtually guaranteeing a fight. Now, there's a lot of empty talk around here about the corrosive influence of partisanship. Well, if you really want to do something about it, you should support a more robust committee process. That's the best way to end the permanent sort of shirts against skins contest the Senate has become. Bills should go through committee. And if Republicans are fortunate enough to gain the majority next year, that will be done. Second, bills should come to the floor and be thoroughly debated. We've got an example of that going on right now. And that includes a robust amendment process. In my view, there's far too much paranoia about the other side around here. What are we afraid of? Both sides have taken liberties and abused privileges, I'll admit that, but the answer isn't to provoke even more. The answer is to let folks debate. This is the Senate. Let folks debate. Let the Senate work its will. And that means bringing bills to the floor. It means having a free and open amendment process. That's legislating. That's what we used to do here. That's exactly the way this place operated just a few years ago. The senior senator from Illinois, the Democratic Assistant Majority Leader, likes to say, or at least used to say, that if you don't want to fight fires, don't become a fireman. And if you don't want to cast tough votes, don't come to the Senate. I guess he hadn't said that lately. When we used to be in the majority, I remember telling people, look, the good news, we're in the majority. The bad news is, in order to get the bill across the floor, you've got to cast a lot of votes you don't want to take. And you know, we did it, and people groaned about it, complained about it. The sun still came up the next day, and everybody felt like they were a part of the process. Well, Senator Durbin was right about that when he said it, and I think it's time to allow senators on both sides to more fully participate in the legislative process. And that means having a more open amendment process around here. As I said, obviously, it requires you to, from time to time, cast votes you'd rather not cast. But we're all grown-ups. I mean, we can take that. There's rarely ever a vote you cast around here that's fatal. And the irony of it all is that kind of process makes the place a lot less contentious. In fact, it's a lot less contentious when you vote on tough issues than when you don't. Because when you're not allowed to do that, everybody is angry about being denied the opportunity to do what you were sent here to do, which is to represent the people that elected you and to offer ideas that you think are worth considering. At a meeting we just came out of, Senator Cornyn was pointing out there were 13 amendments that people on this side of the aisle would like to offer on this bill, all of them related to the subject and important to each senator who seriously felt there was a better way to improve the bill that's on the floor right now. But alas, I expect that opportunity will not be allowed, because one person who's allowed to get prior recognition can prevent us from getting any amendments, or even worse still, pick our amendments for us, decide which of our amendments are okay and which aren't. I remember the late Ted Stevens telling the story about when he first got here, and Senator Mansfield was still the majority leader, and he tried to offer an amendment, Senator Stevens did, and the member of the majority who was managing the bill prevented it, in effect. And Senator Mansfield came over to Senator Stevens, took his amendment, went back to his desk and sent it to the floor for him. Sent it to the floor for him. That was the Senate not too long ago. If someone isn't allowed to get a vote on something they believe in, of course, they're going to retaliate. Of course, they're going to retaliate. But if they get a vote every once in a while, they don't feel the need to. Voting on amendments is good for the Senate, and it's good for the country. Our constituents should have a greater voice in the process. Since July of last year, there have been 4 Republican roll call votes. In the whole second half of 2013, members on this side of the aisle have gotten 4 roll call votes. Stunning. That's today's Senate. So let me say this. If Republicans are fortunate enough to be in the majority next year, amendments will be allowed. Senators will be respected. We will not make an attempt to wring controversy out of an institution that expects, demands, approves of great debates about the problems confronting the country. Now, a common refrain from Democrats is the Republicans have been too quick to block bills from ever coming to the floor. What they fail to mention, of course, is that often we've done this either because we've been shut out of the drafting process, in other words, had nothing to do with writing the bill in the first place, or it's been made pretty clear that there won't be any amendments, which is in all likelihood the situation we're in this very day. In other words, we already knew the legislation was shaping up to be a purely partisan exercise in which people we represent wouldn't have any meaningful input at all. And why would we want to participate in that? Is it good for our constituents? Does it lead to a better product? Of course not. All it leads to is a lot more acrimony. So look, you know, I get it. If Republicans had just won the White House and the House and had a 60-vote majority in the Senate, we'd be tempted to empty our outbox too. But you can't spend 2 years emptying your outbox and then complain about the backlash. If you want fewer fights, give the other side a say. And that brings me to one of the biggest things we've lost around here as I see it. The big problem, my colleagues, has never been the rules. Never been the rules. Senators from both parties have in the past revered and defended the rules during our nation's darkest hours. The real problem is an attitude that views the Senate as an assembly line for one party's partisan legislative agenda, rather than as a place to build consensus to solve national problems. We become far too focused on making a point instead of making a difference. Making a point instead of making good, stable law. We've gotten too comfortable with viewing everything we do here through the prism of the next election instead of the prism of duty, and everyone suffers as a result. As I see it, a major turning point came during the final years of the Bush administration, when the Democratic majority held vote after vote on bills they knew wouldn't pass. Now, look, I'm not saying Republicans have never staged a show vote when we were in the majority. I'm not saying I don't even enjoy a good messaging vote from time to time. But you got to wonder, if that's all you're doing, why you're here. It's become entirely too routine, and it diminishes the Senate. I don't care which party you're in. You came here to legislate, to make a difference for your constituents, yet over the past several years, the Senate seems more like a campaign studio than a serious legislative body. Both sides have said and done things over the past few years we probably wish we hadn't. But we can improve the way we do business. We can be more constructive. We can work through our differences. We can do things that need to be done. But there will have to be major changes if we're going to get there. The committee process must be restored. We need to have an open amendment process. And finally, let me suggest we need to learn how to put in a decent week's work around here. A decent week's work. You know, most Americans don't work 3 days a week. They'd be astonished to find out that that's about it around here. How about the power of the clock to force consensus? The only way 100 senators will be truly able to have their say, the only way we'll be able to work through our tensions and disputes, is if we're here more. Not too long ago, and a number of you will remember this, when Thursday night was the main event around here. Remember that? Thursday night was the main event. And there's a huge incentive to finish on Thursday night if you want to leave on Friday. And so it was amazing how it worked. Even the most eager beaver among us, with a long list of amendments that were good for the country, maybe 10 or 12, around noon on Thursday, it'd be down to 2 or 1 by midnight on Thursday. And it was amazing how consent would be reached when fatigue set in. And all it took was for the leader, the majority leader, who's in charge of the agenda, to say, look, you know, this is important. There's bipartisan support for this. It came out of committee. We want to have an open amendment process, but we want to finish this week, and we can finish on Thursday afternoon or Thursday night or Friday morning. I mean, we almost never get worn out around here. Whatever happened to the fatigue factor to bring things to a close? Amendments voluntarily go away, but important ones still get offered. And everybody feels like they've got a chance to be involved in the process, no matter which side of the aisle they're on. And this is particularly effective, obviously, on bills that have come out of committee with bipartisan support, so there's an interest actually in passing it. We almost never do that anymore. Almost never. On those occasions, we work late, sometimes well into the morning. I know that sounds kind of quaint to people who haven't been around here very long, but it actually worked. And there's nothing wrong with staying up a little later and getting to a conclusion. I can remember the majority leader himself, when he was whip, walking around late at night on Thursdays with his whip card, making sure he had enough votes to do whatever he wanted to do. And when you finish one of those debates, whether you ended up voting for the bill or voting against the bill, you didn't have the feeling that unless you chose to go away with your amendment, you'd have been denied the opportunity to participate and to be a part of the process and actually make a difference for your constituents. That's how you reach consensus, by working and talking and cooperating through give and take. That's the way everyone's patience is worn down, not just the majority leader's patience. Everyone can agree on a result, even if they don't vote for it in the end. Using the clock to force consensus is the greatest proof of that. And if Republicans are in the majority next year, we'll use the clock. Everybody gets an opportunity, but we'll use the clock, we'll work harder, and get results. Restoring the committee process, allowing the senators to speak through an open amendment process, extending the work week are just a few things the Senate could and should do differently. None of it would guarantee an end to partisan rancor. There's nothing wrong with partisan debates. It's good for the country. None of it would cause us to change our principles or our views about what's right and what's wrong with our country. Partisanship itself is not the problem. The real problem is in a growing lack of confidence in the Senate's ability to mediate the tensions and disputes we have always had around here. There are many reasons some have lost that confidence. And ultimately, both parties have to assume some of the blame. But we can't be content to leave it at that. For the good of the country, we need to work together to restore this institution. America's strength and resilience has always depended on our ability to adapt to the various challenges of our day. Sometimes that's meant changing the rules when both parties think it's warranted. And when the majority leader decided a few weeks back to defy bipartisan opposition, it was bipartisan opposition to what happened in November, by changing the rules that govern this place with a simple majority, he broke something. He broke something. But our response can't be to just sit back and accept the demise of the Senate. This body has survived mistakes and excesses before. And even after some of its worst period, it's found a way to spring back and to be the place where even the starkest differences and the fiercest ideological disputes are hashed out by consensus and mutual respect. Indeed, it's during periods of its greatest polarization that the value of the Senate is most clearly seen. So let me wrap it up this way. You know, we're all familiar with the Lyndon Johnson reign around here. Robert Carroll has given us that story in great detail. And some look at LBJ's well-known heavy-handedness as a kind of mastery. That's the way some look at it. Personally, I've always believed the leader that replaced him was a better fit for this place. And evidently so did Johnson's colleagues, who elected Mansfield upon Johnson's departure with overwhelming enthusiasm. They had had it up to here with LBJ. They were excited that he was gone. In fact, Carroll reports that he tried to come to the first lunch after he became vice president and was going to act as the sort of de facto majority leader, even though he was now vice president. That was, shall I say, unenthusiastically received, and he was almost literally thrown out of the lunch, never to return. And Mansfield was, as I said, enthusiastically chosen to replace him. Now, the chronicles of LBJ's life and legacy usually leave out what I just told you. But by the time he left the Senate, as I indicated, his colleagues had had enough of him right up to here. They may have bent to his will while he was here, but the moment they had a chance to be delivered from his iron-fisted rule, they took it. With their support, Mike Mansfield would spend the next 16 years restoring the Senate to a place of greater cooperation and freedom. And as we look at what the Senate could be, not what it is now, but what it could be, Mansfield's period gives us a clue. There are many well-known stories about Mansfield's fairness and equanimity as leader. But they all seem to come down to one thing, and that was his unbending belief that every single senator was equal. That was Mansfield's operating mode. Every single senator was equal. He acted that way on a daily basis, conducted himself on that way as a daily basis. The unbending belief that every senator should be treated as equal. So look, both sides will have to work to get us back to where we should be. It's not going to happen overnight. We haven't had much practice lately. In fact, we're completely out of practice at doing what I just suggested are the first steps to get us back to normal. But it's a goal that I truly believe we can all agree on and agree to strive toward together, and it takes no rules change. This is a behavioral problem. Doesn't require a rules change. We just need to act differently with each other, respect the committee process, have an open amendment process, work a little harder. None of that requires a rules change. Because restoring this institution is the only way we'll ever solve the challenges we face. That's the lesson of history and the lesson of experience. And we would all be wise to heed it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I want to congratulate the Republican leader for his remarks, and I think without being presumptuous,